American Express, Visa, and MasterCard will now start using a new merchant code for firearms and ammunition retailers. They're doing it to comply with a new California law. This will now allow banks to track suspicious purchases. The Second Amendment is still in effect, but more and more lawmakers apparently don't think it matters. Joining me now to discuss this and other economic consequences of the Biden dictatorship is our good friend and New York Times bestselling author of You Will Own Nothing, Carol Roth. Carol, do you think the use of the word dictatorship is too hyperbolic?
I don't. I think that people will come to me all the time and say, oh, I'm worried about Trump being authoritarian or being a dictator. And I feel like that is the perfect description of the Biden administration. And I hate to, Glenn, even say that it's Biden because we've all seen him. He's, completely senile.
Yeah,
he can't, find his way anywhere. So whoever is pulling the strings here, they are taking away more and more of our economic freedoms. And if you go from the beginning of time, from the COVID mandates where he took frontline workers and said, you need to take a vaccine in order to work, through his stoking historic inflation, through weaponizing the US dollar, through window dressing the US economy with debt, through killing the middle and working class by stoking inflation. Now these rules where they want to kill independent contractor and gig work, even the economic consequences with ignoring his duty to protect the border, all of these things really underscore this economic fascism that's come out of this administration.
So let's talk about that here just for a second on the way the administrative state works. When you are a fascist or a dictator of sorts, what you do is you go around the people and you go around Congress. You just execute. So I read a story today that some of these left-wing organizations are asking now for an increase in the minimum wage from, what is it now, $16 to $50 an hour. $50 an hour. There's not a business from here to, the other end of the world that can afford a $50 minimum wage. Well, that won't go through Congress. That won't have to be voted on. They used to have to vote on things like this and argue back and forth. Now the administrative state can just execute some of these things on their own.
Yes,
that is the definition of dictatorship, isn't it?
It is. And this whole rule by the executive branch when we're supposed to have checks and balances has been absolutely disgusting. And the fact of the matter, it has been shut down time and time again by the Supreme Court that says you can't do these things. But then the Biden administration just shifts and said, oh, well, we're going to wait this out or we're going to come back in a different way. Whether it was, around the COVID rent mandates or we're going to all of a sudden just dismiss student loans. They keep getting challenged on these things and they say, well, we lost this one, but we're going to still do it again. Yes. And challenge failing and they still do it again. And this, this anti-gig worker and independent contractor rule, which basically didn't get through Congress. It was part of the PRO Act and they couldn't push it through Congress. They said, well, it just doesn't matter. We're going to go through the Department of Labor and we're going to take away economic freedoms from 70 million freelancers and independent contractors and all the small businesses that depend on them. And they're doing it, again, without this system of checks and balances. And the fact of the matter that we don't have more people standing up and saying this is absolutely unacceptable and marching on Washington for these kinds of things is allowing them to continue to do this.
And that's where dictatorships become so insidious because they convince you that you can't do anything, which in a dictatorship you usually can't unless you want to go to prison or a gulag or whatever. But in a representative republic, you can do something. You talk to your representative. But the system that we have that we're using now, and look, every Republican and Democrat, probably since Coolidge died, They all have used this administrative state to their own advantage one way or another. But it has grown to such a extent to where nothing is being done by Congress. There is no regulation that is happening through Congress. You can't argue back and forth with, the gig workers. They don't have to. The government will just do it, and it will be a faceless person in a faceless arm of the administration. And you'll just have to say, well, that was the Department of Labor that made that. So you have no place to go.
Right. And it used to be that when Congress did nothing, that was a good thing. We would say, well, at least they're not screwing up our lives. That's a happy moment. We're okay that we have gridlock. But when you have the executive branch taking over that rulemaking, that lawmaking, and saying, well, we're going to dictate what you can and can't do, it becomes absolutely demoralizing. And whether it is a direct impact, like some of these rules we're seeing, or some of the fiscal policies that they're putting in place that have just completely demoralized young people in this country to believing they're not going to have the administrative dream or the American dream. It's all because of the administrative state and because these people want more and more power and more control, which is the exact opposite of what this country was founded on.
You know, I've always felt that Osama bin Laden used some of our strengths against us. They used diversity against us. They used compassion against us. They use our own openness and free to go anywhere and be your own person against us. The left has learned this, and I want to go back to the American Express Visa and MasterCard thing. What we've got in two places now, in two different pretty big issues. One, the Second Amendment. You have the banks now monitoring purchases of ammunition and firearms. Well, so now we're taking record. That's part of the reason why you're not allowed to have a record as the federal government of everybody who has purchased a gun. You don't want that. That leads to all bad things. We've never had that. But now we're getting it through the banks. And one of the reasons why we're getting it through the banks is because of another trick. California. If California makes the pork producers or the beef producers change the way they provide beef, or they change the way of octane or emissions in gas, a lot of the country has to go with what California does, because nobody can afford to lose California. Nobody can afford to not live to that standard. And so you just get that. Same thing with getting rid of cars. I think, what was it, 2035, all gasoline cars are supposed to be gone in California. And that includes now, because they signed a deal with Virginia, it just snowballs. And the people around are like, wait, I didn't vote for this. California did. I didn't.
Yeah, and California is the incubator of all bad ideas. This gig worker rule that we've talked about that came out of AB5 in California. A lot of these green policies, things like, whether you can use a gas stove or not, do come out of California. And they use that to incubate and test out these bad ideas. And then what happens? Everyone says, oh, well, it's California. You get what you vote for. But then it seeps into the rest of the country. And this is the thing that I try to raise time and time again, is as California goes, so goes the rest of the country. And they have found a formula for really bad ideas, which are now being implemented in many cases without congressional action.